Morning. Can everyone hear me in the back? We're all good? Okay, so I'm going to go through a presentation, but I'd like you to stop if you have questions, or stop me if you have questions, because really what I'm looking for today is to help you understand the science of ocean acidification so that you can explain it to others. So if I'm unclear at any point, just let me know. So I'll start with something fun. And that is that Earth's history, or Earth is always changing, and the communities of the past are not the communities that we expect to see today or in the future. And so in this context, it's interesting to think about climate change and how past climate changes have influenced biological communities. So typically, massive climate changes happen when we have big releases of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Those in the past have been caused by geologic events, volcanoes, or massive eruptions like the Siberian traps, where you had, over thousands of years, a big volcanic event in eastern Russia that released a ton of carbon dioxide and precipitated a climate change. What I'm interested in is what ecological communities of the future are going to look like in this current age of climate change. And I do that in a number of ways. So this is actually a video. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you because we don't have internet access here. But if you just want to jot down this name, the NOAA Earth History Research Lab, and try to look at this at some point in your free time. It's, I think, one of the most engaging and powerful demonstrations of how the Earth's climate is changing and how carbon dioxide is increasing. So on the y-axis in this graph, we have carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million. And on the x-axis, we have years, and KY-BCE is kiloyear before the Common Era, or thousands of years before the Common Era. So what we have, 200,000 years ago to 800,000 years ago. And what you can see here is that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does change over time due to natural processes. But in the current era with humans, we see this massive increase in carbon dioxide outside of the range of what the Earth has experienced in the past 800 million years ago, and with a much higher rate. And so if you can watch the video, what it shows is actually the breathing of the Earth in terms of carbon dioxide. When the northern hemisphere greens up and leafs out, you have a drawdown of carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere, and in the northern winter, you have actually an increase in the atmosphere. So it shows these yearly processes and the increase in carbon dioxide over time, which is really cool, I think, for people to see, because you can see the increase in the global atmosphere, in the carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere over the course of your own life, and especially students' own lives. So it's a really cool animation. Well, I'm here not to talk about climate change, but to talk about ocean acidification. And there are two distinct processes, both caused by carbon dioxide. So you don't necessarily have to accept the phenomenon of climate change to accept the phenomenon of ocean acidification, which has been helpful for the issue in policy circles. So what ocean acidification is an increase in ocean acidity due to an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. It seems a little odd that these things would be linked, but I'm going to talk you through the chemistry of why that is. Before I do that, I just want to define some terms. I'm going to be using acidity and pH, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but a lot of people out there aren't. So acidity is a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution, and pH is the scale that we use to measure this concentration. So over here I have a pH scale. And what you can see is that seawater here is at about pH of 8. Can you guys see this? Am I blocking it? Okay, I'm blocking it a little bit. Can I go over here? Okay. Hopefully, is this a problem for you? Okay, good. What What you can see is that pH is always, the seawater is basic, and so that gets confusing for some people when you talk about acidification. Well, we don't expect the oceans to become acidic. We just expect them to become acidic in period, being below 7 on the pH scale, but we expect pH of seawater to move this way, which is why it's called acidification. So the pH scale is different than many other scales that people are familiar with because it's on a log base. So remember, when you're counting on a log scale, you don't count 1, 2, 3, you count 1, 10, 100. And thus a small change in pH, like a 0.1 change in pH, is actually a large actual change in the concentration of hydrogen ions, or acidity. So here, a 0.1 change in pH is a 30% increase in hydrogen ion concentrations. And I bring up this number because that's the amount that the oceans have acidified since the Industrial Revolution. So in the past 250 years, the ocean has become 30% more acidic. So this is for you guys, not for your students, but it shows the link between the pH scale and carbon dioxide that has occurred since the scale began. So the scale was made by a brewer or a chemist who worked in a brewery at the Carlsberg laboratory over 100 years ago. And so what he was studying was the biological processes that were used in fermentation of beer and needed a way to measure how much carbon dioxide was in these solutions that they were making, and he developed the pH scale to do that. So as I mentioned, ocean acidification has already occurred. This is a picture of the change in pH over the world's oceans since 250 years ago. The hotter the colors, the more the change. And what you'll see here is that all of the change is negative. So the pH of the oceans globally has decreased. What you can see here is some variation in the color, where you have more change in colder waters than you do in warmer waters. And one of the reasons for that is because solutions that are cold can hold more carbon dioxide, more gas, and then solutions that are warm. And so this is something that almost everyone is familiar with. When you take a soda out of the fridge and you leave it on the counter, it just spontaneously bubbles, right? So that bubbling is occurring because the solution is warming up and it can't hold as much carbon dioxide. The same principle falls for the oceans, and why the colder waters are more carbonated than the warmer waters. So now we'll get to the scary part. I'm going to walk you through the equation of ocean acidification, showing you some data to really play out how this happens in terms of the chemistry. So carbon dioxide is what we call an acid gas. When carbon dioxide dissolves into water, it breaks apart the water molecule. And so I can show that here. So here we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what I'm showing is a data set from off of Hawaii. So if we have Hawaii down here, the atmospheric samples were taken on the top of Mauna Loa. And this is the same time series that Al Gore talked about in the movie Inconvenient Truth. And then there's a paired data set that's taken here at the Hawaiian Ocean Time Series. Coming back to these data, what you have here is time and then carbon dioxide on the Y. And you can see an increase in carbon dioxide in the air, which I've represented here. What you can also see is an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that is in seawater. So oceanographers can measure what we call the PCO2, or the carbon dioxide that's in water, aqueous. And what you can see is that these two measures rise in parallel. And this is a great demonstration of just one of the laws of thermodynamics. You have a diffusion of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the water. Then we get to this graph, which is where a lot of the action is. And I'll step you through the equation first. So I described how when carbon dioxide dissolves into water, it breaks apart the water molecule. And what that does is it forms carbonic acid, which is this compound here. Acids typically don't like to stay in their combined form in water, so this molecule breaks apart into two forms, either bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion or carbonate and a hydrogen ion. And I can show you how this is occurring in the ocean with these data here. So in the black data set, we are measuring pH. And what you can see is that as CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere and the ocean, pH is decreasing. Okay? And this is one of the odd things, as pH decreases, that is measuring an increase in hydrogen ions. And what's also an interesting thing, and we'll get into this more when I talk about the biology, is that the more acidic a solution is, the less of this carbonate ion there is out there, which we can measure here with this green data set. Okay? And this is because the more hydrogen ions there are around, meaning the more acidic a solution is, the more these hydrogen ions glom onto this molecule here and turn it into bicarbonate. Yes?
What is bicarbonate?
That's a hard thing for me to answer. What is bicarbonate? It's a form of carbon dioxide in water. I can't come up with any analogies of something tangible that's bicarbonate. Can anyone else help me with that? Yeah, this is the molecular formula here. But in terms of a tangible, baking soda, right. Yeah, that's sodium bicarb. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. So sodium bicarb is a salt, a bicarbonate salt. What's that? Yes, thank you. Yeah. I should know that. I used that in the lab. Okay, yeah.
So backing up just a minute,
Uh-huh.
you said if there's more hydrogen ions,
Mm-hmm.
then it's going to push the equilibrium.
Push the equilibrium to the left, which means that there's less free carbonate and more bicarbonate.
Which will make it.
It doesn't change the acidity, it just changes the nature of the solution.
Thank you.
Yes?
So pH is a measure of the amount of free hydrogen
Mm-hmm.
in water?
Yes. Yeah. It's a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions. Yeah. And I like this demonstration because it shows how chemical formulas can be used. And then I like pairing it with this data here to show the process so that people can see how this chemistry is being played out in the environment. So getting back to words, let's think about what is going to happen to oceans in the future. So ocean acidity, if carbon dioxide emissions continue as they are now, and as we expect them to, ocean acidity could increase by 100 to 150% by the year 2100. So what this means is 100 to 150% in the concentration of hydrogen ions, which, if we translated it to the pH scale, is a drop of about 0.3 or 0.4. So let's think about that in terms of what our coastal ocean could look like. This is a map of the West Coast to orient you. This is San Francisco Bay right here. And these are results from a model that's modeling ocean pH. So here, the cooler the colors, the higher pH, warmer colors, lower pH. And what you see as you go from 250 years ago to today, a real drop in the pH of our coastal waters in the West Coast. And as we look into the future, we expect more of a drop. So ocean pH is changing. What does that really mean for organisms, and how does this drop in pH that we're experiencing today relate to what has happened in the past? The last kind of big time series that I showed you of carbon dioxide at the beginning of the talk was in the atmosphere. Well, let's think about what pH is in the ocean. So this is a pretty complex graph, but I'll walk you through it. We have pH on the y-axis, and we have time on the x-axis. what's interesting about this graph is that the scale of the x-axis changes. So here, every tick mark is 10 years. Here, every big tick mark is 1,000,000 years, and this is million years before present. Here it's 10 million years, and here it's 200 million years. So where we are is right here at a pH of below 8.1. And this gray scatter is just expressing the range in pH that's measured in the ocean. The ocean is not a constant place. There's a lot of variability. So that's what this cloud shows. And what's interesting is to think about where this point is in comparison to the ocean in the past. What you can see is some variation in the ocean over time. This is around the dawn of man. The last time the ocean was at the pH where it is today was the dawn of modern horses. The last time the ocean pH was where we expect it to be in year 2100 was when T-Rex was on the Earth. Below that was velociraptors. The second time in history where ocean pH was where it is today was the dawn of complex fishes. And then this graph rounds out here with the dawn of complex life. Okay, so what I'm showing you this graph for three reasons. One is to express to you that ocean life can exist at many different pHs. So with ocean acidification, we don't expect an empty ocean. But what we can see is that this change that's occurring in ocean pH is occurring much more rapidly than it has in the past. Okay, so it's ocean acidification is, I think it's, Paul, you might be able to help me with this statistic, but 10 times more rapid than it has been in the recent geological past. And so this, we think, is a problem for organisms and for animals. We're uncertain about how many species and which species are going to be able to evolve and adapt to this very rapidly changing chemical environment. In addition, these big drops in pH that have occurred in the past, even though they look like they might be occurring at a different rate or a faster rate on this graph, you have to think about this drop being over the course of 100 million years here, and this drop is occurring over 100 years. In the past, these big drops in ocean pH have been linked with mass extinction events in the marine ocean. So some organisms can't tolerate the change, whereas others can. Yes? Yeah, that's a good question. So the different colors here indicate different ways of calculating the pH of the ocean. What we can do, what's been done in this red line here and actually back to this blue line is they've been able to measure the concentration of carbon dioxide in gas bubbles trapped in ice, and then they can extrapolate the pH of the oceans from that simple relationship that I showed you before. And then where you get to these dotted lines and the blue lines, there are proxies that you can use to calculate the pH of the ocean, in some ways using animals. So these organisms called foraminifera make these calcium carbonate shells, and they can look at the ratios of different elements in the shell to assess the pH of the ocean. So a variety of different ways that people use chemical techniques in geology and paleobiology. Yeah, fossil stuff. Yeah. So it's a mix, and that's why there are different colors on the graph to show the mix of different ways to assess pH. So that's the chemistry part of the portion, and now we're going to move into the biology, and I'm going to talk about both species and then ecosystems. So a great experiment to show people that pH or biological organisms are sensitive to pH is to actually hold your breath. Do this if you'd like to, and at some point you're going to feel the urge to breathe. Most people think that they're running out of oxygen. It's actually not the case. What your body is sensing when you hold your breath is a buildup of carbon dioxide in the tissues, which is sensed by a receptor that is sensing the change in pH of the fluids. And what you want to do when you feel that urge to breathe is actually exhale that carbon dioxide that's building up in your body. So it's the same process that we're thinking about with ocean acidification, this carbonation of fluids. And were you to not be able to exhale properly, that can lead to a condition called respiratory acidosis, which happens in people when they have respiratory ailments. And if it gets severe, and you have a pH change in the body of 0.3, 0.4, that can lead to coma and seizures, and in some cases, death. Remember, 0.3 or 0.4 change in pH is what we expect in the oceans in the next 100 years. So I talked about this molecule carbonate when I introduced you to the chemistry of ocean acidification. And I did it because we're actually more familiar with calcium carbonate than we are with a lot of other parts of the carbon system. The lower calcium carbonate is in the solution, the more calcium carbonate wants to dissolve to come into equilibrium. And the harder it is for organisms to fight the equation to the left, the harder it is for organisms to build calcium carbonate shells. Okay, so a lot of ocean acidification is the chemical process of what's going to happen to shells once they are formed, but then the biological process of how organisms are going to fight against this gradient and have enough energy to build their shells. Okay, so people are familiar with this form of calcium carbonate. This is actually made up of millions of crystals, which look like this. So these are two different forms of calcium carbonate, a crystal called calcite and a crystal called aragonite. And these are great ways to show people that shells aren't just this kind of opaque white substance, but are collections of these crystals. And these are geologically formed. So we can pass these around. Oops. And actually, that reminds me that I forgot my demonstration. So Scott, if you want to come up here. So I wanted to show you that how carbon dioxide can change the chemistry of a solution. So what I have here is a bottle of seawater, and I've put a dye in it, an indicator dye. And this dye is blue when the pH is high, and it turns to yellow when the pH is lower. And that actually occurs because the hydrogen ion binds with the dye and changes its color. So what I have here is a bike pump for flat tires, and it's just a cartridge of carbon dioxide. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bubble the solution and show you how the pH of the solution is going to change just by adding carbon dioxide to it. Okay. Oops. So it's a nice demonstration to show this inorganic chemistry change and how it's related to pH. Yeah?
Where do you get the CO2 cans?
At a bike store or Amazon. Do they sell them? Yeah, or you can use well, the thing is you can use a straw. But so there's a dye in there. It's called bromothymol blue. And you don't want to ingest that. And so when you give people straws, you have to worry that they might suck in instead of blowing out. So using the CO2 cartridge is a nice way to get around that potential safety problem. Okay, well, I talked about the impact of ocean acidification on shells briefly, but changes in pH and carbon dioxide and seawater can have a variety of different effects physiologically on a real range of different organisms. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the amount of carbon dioxide and the pH of the environment can affect respiration. So, for example, squid, which are highly energetic, might be really impacted by changes in pH of the ocean, given the nature of the binding protein in their blood that transports oxygen and how changes in pH affect it in a negative way. Whereas seagrasses are actually going to be fertilized by extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so two sides of the coin here. We have a loser in the situation of ocean acidification and a winner, a species that will benefit. A lot of the biological research on ocean acidification explores the impact of acidification on development. So the process that organisms go through as they turn from an egg into the different larval forms into the adult stage. And so it turns out in some organisms, for example, like crab, and one of our colleagues and Paul Williams are exploring the impact of ocean acidification on the development of the Dungeness crab to see if changes in pH can influence this, and it's looking like they might. Ocean acidification can also influence growth of organisms. So I talked about the balance between the dissolution and the development of shells. So this can impact the growth of a lot of shellfish species. I'll go into that in more detail. But it can also influence the growth of things that don't form shells, things like fish. So this Atlantic silverside experiences a decrease in growth in acidified waters. And then there's a lot of odd effects of ocean acidification that we weren't expecting. And I'll get into these a little more, but it turns out that ocean acidification can influence the behavior and nervous systems of some organisms. So this is a really cool graphic showing how one of the ways that we can draw inference about what might happen to the world's oceans under ocean acidification. So what this is two pictures under the sea off of the coast of Italy near the volcano Mount Vesuvius. And so this volcano is very famous for destroying Pompeii. Turns out that the volcano is still active, and one of the things that it does is it causes carbon dioxide to bubble out of the seafloor into the ocean, and that's what you see here. This is called a champagne site. So as a biologist, what you can look at when you consider these two images is what's there in the water when it's acidified versus not. What you can see is an abundance of life in both pictures, but very different communities. Okay, so under the normal ocean, what you have is a lot of organisms that produce calcium carbonate. Okay, so for example, urchins, this crustose coralline algae, and a very wide diversity of animal life and plant life. But what you see over here is a real preponderance of the algae. They're growing really well in this acidified environment, and you don't see the calcifiers. And there are a number of sites like this around the world where scientists are using this natural experiment to understand how communities of species respond to changes in pH over long periods of time. So this gets me into this question of what we know about the biological impacts of acidification versus what we can infer. So our understanding of the biological impacts of ocean acidification is really in its infancy. The field is about 10 years old, so we're kind of in the dark ages. And what we're trying to do right now is understand a lot of the gross impacts, and we're going to get into the real more nitty-gritties of the physiology later. So it's a new field of science, which leads us to have trouble making a lot of generalizations and trouble making a lot of specific answers about what's going to happen under acidification, but we can make some generalizations given what we know about the response of some species to acidification and some basic principles of biology and physiology. What I'm going to walk you through is some examples on commercial species. So there's obviously a big concern in the shellfish industry about the impacts of acidification on the shelled organisms that they're growing and harvesting. And so what these images show you is results from two different experiments on three different species. Two East Coast species, a hard clam and a bay scallop, and then a West Coast species, the Pacific oyster. And as you go down the slide, the pH that the organisms were exposed to decreases. What you can see here is that organisms are able to persist in a range of different pH environments, but at low pH, they're smaller. They just don't have the energy to maintain the growth of the shell and other physiological processes. Over here, when pH was really low, you see real big issues in development. These organisms are all the same age, but these are malformed. So it turns out that Washington State is really at the epicenter of this impact of ocean acidification on commercial shellfish. We're the first place in the world where the impacts of acidification are being seen by an industry and by a culture. And what has happened in the past decade or past 7 or 8 years is that there's this crisis in the oyster industry where hatcheries are unable to produce the amount of oyster larvae or seed that they were able to produce in the past. And this is their business, producing these young oysters for other people to grow up and sell. In some years, production was down 60 or 70%. And it's not just occurring in the hatcheries. Out in the wild in Willapa Bay, the industry relied mostly on natural recruitment of oysters. But over 7 years, there was enough oyster recruitment to support a commercial harvest just once. So for a range of 6 years, that commercial set just didn't happen. And what scientists have done is linked this problem in the Northwest oyster industry to the carbon chemistry of the ocean. And done it in a number of ways. The most elegant way is with this study that I'm going to show here, which was done at the Whiskey Creek Hatchery in Netards Bay in Oregon. And this hatchery spawns their oysters a number of times throughout the summer. And as I mentioned earlier, ocean chemistry is variable. So these spawns happened when the ocean was at different levels of pH. So that's what you can see here on this top graph. We have pH on the y-axis, day of the year on the x-axis. And this is a different way of measuring the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's called the saturation state of aragonite. This is aragonite. So the spawns happened where these dots are. So at different levels of pH. And what the hatchery and the scientists found was that when pH was low, which was down here, production is lower. And growth of the oysters in this one larval stage was also lower. So they were able to use water chemistry to understand why their oyster spawns and rearing worked well at some times and not so well at other times. This has provided an opportunity for the industry to adapt. So what they're now doing is choosing to spawn their oysters only when the pH is high and protecting the young oysters from the influx of low pH water into the hatchery. So to show you a visual of that, we have oysters at 2 ages, day 1 of their life and day 4 of their life. And on the left side, this is when CO2 was low or pH was high. And this shows you what the oysters look like when CO2 was high or pH was low. So not only are the oysters smaller, but there are a number of deformities in the development, which are indicated by these arrows. So these are at conditions that are seen sometimes today. So all is not lost because there's variation in biology. The Pacific oyster seems to be a very sensitive species to acidification. Other species of oyster, it turns out, are not as sensitive. So a colleague at the Smithsonian did a study to understand comparatively how 2 oyster species that are cultivated in the Chesapeake respond to acidification. So this is the eastern oyster and the Sumino oyster. And what he found was that the eastern oyster was quite sensitive to acidification, as we expect to occur in the future, but the Sumino oyster was not. Okay, so again, this shows the variation in biology in response to these changes in chemistry, and exemplifies how it's hard for us to generalize at this point what the fate of marine communities is, given the variation in response. Yeah?
Okay, so I haven't heard of the Sumino oysters.
Mm-hmm.
Where are they from?
They're from Japan.
Japan.
Just like the Pacific oyster is. So this crisis in the oyster industry that we experience in the Northwest is with the non-native oyster, the cultivated oyster. The Olympia oyster, which is the native oyster, is also sensitive to acidification, but it hasn't had the commercial interest because it's not commercially reared right now very widely. Although it is a Taylor shellfish where you guys are going this afternoon. No, they have the same chemistry of their shell, the same aragonite crystals when it's early in life, and then they switch to calcite later in life. These are 2 species in the same genus, so they're extremely closely related. The difference that the researcher pointed to as a mechanism for the result was the growth rate of the larvae. And so in the eastern oyster, they grow quickly through the larval stage. The sumino oyster, they grow more slowly. And so that might allow the organism to have more time to build its shell and potentially more energetic reserves. So there's a lot of research going on in the Pacific Northwest and around the globe on a variety of species, and especially commercial species. And because of the variation in the biology, we can't say, oh, we're just going to generalize this result from Pacific oysters to everything. No, we need to step through the species to really understand how each is going to respond. So in our laboratory, we've done work on gooey ducks, Dungeness crab, manila crabs. Some colleagues at Friday Harbor at the University of Washington have done work with Olympia crabs. We've done some work with mussels, as have our UW colleagues. And the UW came up with this really cool result on some response of mussels to acidification. What they found is that the byssal threads, the beard of the mussel, is actually affected by small changes in pH. And when pH is lower, this byssal thread is more brittle and not as strong. And so that leads to implications on the life history of this organism beyond just the growth of the shell. So will it be able to stay attached to the lines that people use for cultivation or to the rocks where it lives in its natural habitat, were the byssal threads to be compromised? So unfortunately, I can't show you this video, and I wanted to. This breaks us out from commercial species into species that are very important in marine food webs. This is a pteropod, and it's a small snail that's about this big. And instead of living on the benthos on the ground, it flies through the water column. So it's turned its feet into wings. And so it kind of flies around like Dumbo, and it's this beautiful species. Turns out that it's also extremely important in high-latitude marine food webs. It's a very important food species for salmon, for whales, for birds, a number of fish. And this delicate aragonite shell that it makes is very sensitive to changes in pH. So this shows you 3 pictures that I took, or my intern took last summer for a study that we did together. And this is what a shell of a pteropod looks like at ocean chemistry that's average today. This is what we expect in real deep oceans, or maybe 100 years in the future. And this organism is raised in conditions that we expect in the very far future or in the deep in the future. And what you can see here, this cloudiness is dissolution of the shell. And then here, obviously, these holes are dissolution of the shell. So I exposed these organisms to different chemistry waters for a week, and this is what happened. And all of these animals were living. So the shells of these pteropods were dissolving around them. This has implications for marine food webs. And it's also been observed in the wild. So these are 2 images taken by a postdoc in our lab, Nina Bednarsik, and she was doing research down in the Antarctic. And what she found was that in most of her samples, the shells of the pteropods looked great. They're very smooth, showed no dissolution. But in some samples, she saw a lot of dissolution occurring in the shell. And what this study showed was the first indication of impacts of acidification in a wild organism in the marine environment. So as I mentioned earlier, there's some things that really surprised us about what some of the impacts of acidification may be. So on the right side of the slide, you can see 2 phytoplankton species and a bloom of phytoplankton here. What these 2 species are harmful algal bloom species. And one of our colleagues down in University of Southern California did some research with these guys and put them under ocean acidification conditions. And what he found is that these species bloom more readily, and they produce more toxins in low pH water, which has, is a very surprising result and has big implications for human health and marine communities. This picture of Nemo that I've shown here is up there to indicate some of the results that colleagues in Australia have found working with the clownfish. And what they did was they reared the larvae of these clownfish in conditions resembling ocean acidification. And what they found was that their behavior was really weird. They were no longer avoiding the smell of their predators. They were responding to sound in odd ways. They weren't homing in on the cues to the habitat they're supposed to settle in. And any of the behavioral assays they did with these organisms raised in acidified water just showed weirdness. And so they got a molecular physiologist involved, and what he found was that this neurotransmitter called GABA the function of this neurotransmitter was altered when the larvae were in low pH water. So neurotransmitters are something that we're familiar with when people talk about depression and other chemical imbalances. Those often go through GABA receptor pathways. And so it's this really big influence on the biology of the organism caused by changes in this neurotransmitter precipitated by changes in environmental pH. Again, totally unexpected. A lot of phytoplankton species are benefited by acidification, and when they bloom, they take up carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. What happens in blooms is actually can be odd when you're thinking about coastal areas. So you have these big phytoplankton blooms that then die and they sink, and bacteria start eating them. Bacteria take oxygen and respire it into carbon dioxide. And so whereas you would think that a bloom would be a good thing, when you think about the whole food web, it turns out actually in some cases being a big carbon source and causes a local acidification event. And local acidification events, when they're caused by algal blooms like this, are also more commonly thought about as hypoxic events or low oxygen events. The two go hand in hand. So let's actually start thinking about translating the results from single species into communities. And so a lot of what I've talked about is the direct impacts of ocean acidification on some of these species that are lower in the food web. Well, because organisms are connected in the environment through food webs, there's the possibility that direct effects on some species can have indirect effects on other species that won't be impacted by acidification at all. So we do not expect any problems for whales, given their strong control over their internal physiology. But if their food is impacted, their populations will be impacted as well. So what I've done is a lot of this types of modeling to understand these direct and indirect effects. And one step of that was to say, okay, what species are likely to be sensitive to acidification in Puget Sound? It turns out that 30% of our species are calcifiers, they make shells, and so are more likely than other species to be sensitive to acidification. So what I did is I took a model of Puget Sound and I said, okay, well, what happens if some or all of this 30% of species decrease in population sizes due to acidification? What happens to the rest of the food web? So I'll go over some of the general results with you. And the first is that species that are directly affected by acidification are also going to be impacted by predator-prey interactions. So let's say you are negatively affected by acidification, but so is your predator. Your populations might actually stay stable because you're released from predation. So it's very hard to translate studies from the laboratory to what is going to happen in the wild without thinking about these species interactions. Like I mentioned with the whale, ocean acidification will impact species unaffected by changes in pH via, again, predator-prey interactions. So here, for example, a lot of ground fish eat calcifiers. So what might happen to their populations were calcifying populations to decrease? This was a curious one. Which species are affected by ocean acidification will really be driven which species are affected by ocean acidification will drive the nature of the food web response. So instead of my models, I took two different groups of zooplankton, copepods and krill. And I said, what will happen if copepod populations decrease? And what will happen if only krill populations decrease? And what I got was opposite effects on species that we fish because of their large influence on the food web and their different influences on the food web. So some of the work that Jonathan is doing this summer in our laboratory is to explore the impacts of acidification on these two species. And then this is a really important point. So ocean acidification's impact on just one or a few species can have big effects on the food web and ecosystem services. What does that mean? Well, it means that not all species in a food web have to be impacted by acidification for the community to change. If you have a change in a keystone species, that can ripple through the food web in big ways. And so when some people talk about acidification who don't necessarily agree with the concepts and the implications that people are finding with data, they say, well, this species, it's not affected, so this community will not be affected. You can't make that generalization.
Told about someone showed you all fallibilities you were told. About Trinity, would you still know when the work